1. Leningrad's population and strategic importance before the siege. Before the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the city of Leningrad, now known as St. Petersburg, was one of the USSR's most significant urban centers. With a population of approximately 3 million, it was not only a bustling metropolis but also a critical hub of Soviet industry and culture. Leningrad was renowned for its vast industrial complexes that contributed significantly to the Soviet war effort, producing everything from artillery shells to tanks. The city's strategic position on the Baltic Sea made it a vital link between the Soviet Union and its northern allies. Furthermore, Leningrad held immense symbolic value as the cradle of Bolshevism, being the birthplace of the 1917 revolution that led to the establishment of the Soviet state. These factors made Leningrad a prime target for Hitler's Operation Barbarossa, which aimed to crush the Soviet Union through swift and decisive blows against its key cities, with Leningrad being designated as one of the invasion's primary objectives alongside Moscow and Kiev. 2. The initial German advance on Leningrad. By the time German forces under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb's Army Group North reached the outskirts of Leningrad in September 1941, the situation in the city was dire. The Red Army, caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of Operation Barbarossa, had already suffered devastating losses, with hundreds of thousands of troops encircled and captured. Leningrad, woefully underprepared for a siege, was left with a skeleton defense force, poorly supplied and demoralized. Despite these odds, the citizens of Leningrad rallied to the defense of their city. Over 1 million civilians, including women, children, and the elderly, dug trenches, constructed fortifications, and prepared for the inevitable siege. Their efforts were remarkable, as they created multiple defensive lines around the city, complete with reinforced concrete bunkers and improvised barricades. As the Germans closed in, Leningrad became increasingly isolated, with a final railway link to the rest of the Soviet Union severed on September 8, 1941. The only lifeline left was the perilous route across Lake Ladoga, which would soon become known as the Road of Life. 3. The desperate struggle and the Road of Life. As the siege of Leningrad dragged on through the brutal winter of 1941 to 1942, the situation within the city became increasingly dire. Temperatures plummeted to as low as -40 degrees Celsius, and food supplies were nearly exhausted. The city's residents faced starvation, with rations reduced to mere ounces of bread made from sawdust and other inedible fillers. Despite the unimaginable hardships, the people of Leningrad refused to surrender. The only lifeline was the Road of Life, a perilous route across the frozen expanse of Lake Ladoga, which was used to bring in limited supplies and evacuate the most vulnerable. This road, constantly under threat from German artillery and air raids, became a symbol of the city's resilience. Soviet soldiers, truck drivers, and civilians risked their lives daily to maintain this vital supply line. By the end of the siege, over 1 million lives had been lost, but the city had held out, its spirit unbroken. The eventual Soviet counteroffensive in January 1944, which lifted the siege, marked one of the turning points of the war on the Eastern Front. 4. Cannibalism and the overburdened Leningrad police force. During the brutal siege of Leningrad, the city's residents faced unimaginable hardships as starvation became rampant. The situation grew so desperate that an entire wing of the Leningrad police force was established specifically to combat and punish acts of cannibalism among the starving populace. With food supplies nearly exhausted, bread made from sawdust and other inedible fillers became the daily ration, leading some to resort to extreme measures for survival. The Leningrad police force, which had been severely depleted due to conscription, was left with only 5,000 officers out of the original 13,000. These officers were now tasked with the impossible job of maintaining order in a city where the social fabric was disintegrating. They served double duty, not only enforcing the law but also acting as militia to defend the city from the German invaders. In this nightmarish environment, murders over a slice of bread or a scrap of cloth became tragically common, highlighting the dire circumstances under which the city's residents lived. 5. The German siege batteries and Soviet counteroffensives. As the siege of Leningrad dragged into the spring of 1942, the city's residents found little relief despite the thawing temperatures. New horrors emerged as the Germans deployed 3 massive siege batteries that relentlessly bombarded the city, reducing entire neighborhoods to smoldering ruins. The Red Army, despite its best efforts, was unable to break the siege. The Soviets launched numerous counter-offensives in an attempt to relieve Leningrad, but these efforts were often ill-fated and costly. One such operation was the Battle of Lyuban, where the 300,000-strong Second Soviet Shock Army engaged in a grueling battle of attrition against well-entrenched German forces. After months of bitter fighting, the Soviet forces were surrounded and decimated, suffering catastrophic losses. Meanwhile, attempts to break the siege from the Sinyavino heights to the east of Leningrad also ended in failure, with each offensive met by fierce German resistance. Despite these setbacks, a glimmer of hope appeared when Lieutenant General Leonid Gavrilov took command of the Leningrad front in August 1942. Gavrilov began meticulously planning a larger and more coordinated offensive, even as the Germans prepared their own Operation Nordlicht, a full-scale assault on the city's defenses. 6. Gavrilov's stalemate and the persistence of the Leningraders. In August 1942, as Lieutenant General Leonid Gavrilov prepared a massive offensive against the German positions near Leningrad, his plans coincidentally intersected with the German Operation Nordlicht, which aimed to crush the city's defenses once and for all. The two offensives clashed, resulting in a brutal 3-week stalemate. The Soviet forces, despite their tenacity, suffered over 100,000 casualties, while the Germans lost around 26,000. Although the Soviet counteroffensive failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough, it forced the Germans to cancel Operation Nordlicht, weakening Army Group North's overall position. Gavrilov, undeterred by the Pyrrhic victory, spent the remainder of 1942 carefully planning yet another assault, all while the city of Leningrad continued to endure unimaginable hardships. German artillery and Luftwaffe bombers pounded the city day and night, turning entire districts into rubble. The road of life across Lake Ladoga remained the only tenuous lifeline, under constant attack by German aircraft. Yet, astonishingly, the people of Leningrad persevered. Despite the freezing temperatures, unheated workshops continued to produce munitions, and public services like streetcars and schools operated, providing a semblance of normalcy amid the chaos. 7. Surviving the Siege of Leningrad. During the Siege of Leningrad, children were often assigned non-combat roles such as fire-watching, which involved scanning the skies for incendiary bombs and alerting authorities to potential fires. The city's medical services were stretched to their limits, working tirelessly to prevent disease outbreaks. Despite the extreme conditions, they managed to successfully contain potential epidemics of cholera, typhus, and typhoid fever, which could have devastated the already starving population. These heroic efforts were made all the more impressive considering that the average Leningrad worker was surviving on less than 300 calories per day, equivalent to just 3 slices of bread. The endurance of the citizens, despite the extreme hunger and relentless bombing, became a symbol of Soviet resilience during World War II. 8. Overcrowded Leningrad hospital scene. A dimly lit, overcrowded hospital ward filled with emaciated patients lying on makeshift beds. Nurses and doctors, visibly exhausted with dark circles under their eyes, tend to the sick and wounded. The walls are cracked, with some windows boarded up to protect against the cold and explosions. The scene emphasizes the dire conditions, with a focus on the healthcare workers' determination to prevent disease outbreaks amidst the chaos. 9. Workers enduring the siege in Leningrad. A group of skeletal, hollow-eyed factory workers trudging through deep snow toward a war-damaged factory, their breath visible in the freezing air. They are clad in thin, tattered clothing, clutching whatever rations they have left. The factory in the background, though battered, still has smoke rising from its chimneys, symbolizing the undying spirit of the Leningrad citizens who continue to work despite being on the brink of starvation. 10. Operation Iskra, breaking the siege. In January 1943, General Leonid Gavrilov launched Operation Iskra, an ambitious offensive designed to break through the German lines south of Lake Ladoga and link the Leningrad front with the nearby Volkhov front. Despite the seemingly small gap of 16 kilometers between the two fronts, the operation was fraught with challenges, including relentless German artillery fire and the unforgiving terrain of heavily forested wetlands that severely hampered the movement of Soviet mechanized units. The Soviets' only significant advantage was the German severe manpower shortages, which prevented them from launching the aggressive counterattacks and encirclements that had devastated Soviet forces in earlier campaigns. After a grueling 4-day battle, Soviet forces finally linked up with their counterparts, marking the first land connection between Leningrad and the rest of the Soviet Union in over a year. This partial success allowed for a trickle of supplies to reach the besieged city, but the overall situation remained dire, with the Germans still entrenched around Leningrad. 11. Operation Polar Star, a missed opportunity asterisk. In early 1943, the Soviets planned Operation Polar Star, a grand offensive aimed at encircling and destroying large portions of German Army Group North, which was stubbornly holding its positions around Leningrad. The operation was intended to capitalize on the momentum gained from Operation Iskra, but the Germans, anticipating the Soviet strategy, preemptively evacuated many of the key areas targeted for encirclement. This shortened their defensive lines and left the exhausted Soviet forces with no choice but to halt their advance until the spring thaw. Despite the ultimate failure of Polar Star, the operation demonstrated the Soviets' growing strategic and operational capabilities, even as they struggled against a well-entrenched and resourceful enemy. The liberation of Leningrad would still take nearly another year, with the city enduring unimaginable hardships in the meantime. 1. The beginning of the Novgorod offensive. The Novgorod offensive commenced on the night of January 13, 1944, with a massive aerial bombardment by Soviet night bombers targeting critical locations across the region. This initial wave of destruction was immediately followed by a relentless, hour-long artillery barrage aimed at the Luftwaffe's regional airfields, effectively suppressing German air power long enough to allow Soviet infantry and mechanized units to break through Army Group North's outer defenses. In less than a day, Soviet forces had advanced along a 10-kilometer (6.21 miles) front, creating a salient that extended 3 kilometers (1.8 miles) deep into enemy territory. The relentless pressure applied by the 42nd and 67th Soviet armies to the south and east of Leningrad during the night further weakened German positions, enabling the main Soviet advance to push an additional 4 kilometers (2.5 miles) forward. These early successes set the stage for the broader offensive, but the cost in Soviet lives was exceptionally high, with hundreds of casualties for every German-held bunker or trench overrun. The devastating human cost of the Siege of Leningrad. The Siege of Leningrad stands as one of the most harrowing chapters of World War II, not only for the brutal conditions endured by the city's civilians but also for the staggering human cost on both sides. During the Arctic winter of 1941, countless Leningrad residents succumbed to starvation or frostbite as temperatures plummeted and food supplies dwindled to nearly nothing. It is estimated that around 640,000 civilians perished during this period, many of them women, children, and the elderly who could not withstand the extreme conditions. However, this tragic figure is overshadowed by the colossal losses sustained by the Red Army in its desperate defense of the city and subsequent efforts to break the German stranglehold. Conservative estimates suggest that Soviet casualties in the Leningrad sector against Army Group North reached around 3 million, a figure that includes those killed, wounded, or captured. In comparison, German losses amounted to approximately 500,000. Adolf Hitler's fixation on obliterating Leningrad, which he deemed the cradle of Bolshevism, is now recognized as one of his critical tactical errors during Operation Barbarossa. His decision to divert vast resources and manpower toward a target of immense symbolic, but limited strategic, importance not only drained his forces but also contributed to the ultimate failure of his campaign in the Soviet Union.